Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's Elizabeth Cronnice McLaughlin. It's the 26th of November, 2019. It's Resistance Live. Hi. This is our last broadcast before the Thanksgiving break. I am traveling with my kids this year for Thanksgiving, so I will be offline Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Doesn't mean I won't be kind of checking in from Twitter from time to time, but I will not be broadcasting for the next 3 days. I'm really hopeful that we're going to get a little bit of a break from the ongoing nightmarish news cycle. Not terribly optimistic that that's going to happen, but hopeful. I would really like for all of us to at least get a little bit of a break. A reminder to all of you that a number of our favorite Congress people have put together little placemats on how to deal with your traumatic Thanksgiving conversations with your Trumpy uncle and your right-wing granddad. Very much want to encourage all of you to do what you feel you need to do this holiday season. Reminder to all of you that Thanksgiving is optional. You do not have to participate if you don't want to, and family is where you make it. I just will reiterate that to everybody who needs to hear it. Wishing you all, of course, as always, very happy Thanksgiving. Very grateful to all of you here on Patreon who are watching along every day over the course of this period of time, and for all of your support over the last year. And hopefully, we'll have the great news of an impeachment vote right after Thanksgiving. That's, my preference, of course. All right. So with all that wonderful, good stuff said about Thanksgiving and great blessings to you and yours, however you choose to navigate this crazy holiday of ours, let's get to kind of a little bit of news from this morning and yesterday. So the big breaking news yesterday was that the DC District Court, under through an incredible 120-page opinion written by Judge Brown Jackson, has ruled that Don McGahn must testify. The opinion itself is obviously substantial at 120 pages. It is clearly written with the thought in mind that the issue may end up in front of the Supreme Court, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the most significant chunk of the opinion that I just want to point to is that it gave a very strong pushback to the idea that there is absolute immunity for a president under our democracy. One of the things I just want to mention here is that, of course, this is obvious to anybody who has read the Constitution, to anybody who understands the nature of the way in which our Constitution was written, to anybody who's familiar with the Federalist Papers, to anyone who understands the pushback against King George that resulted in the founding of America. There is literally no basis for this president to claim that he or the people who work for him have absolute immunity from subpoena power. All that said, however, one of the critical keys of this opinion is that it is a very strong pushback against the arguments that are made by the president. I will tell you that I watched all of this devolve yesterday on television in real time as it was going on. I was very happy to find that Neil Katyal and I are on the same page, which is always a good sign, which is namely that, fundamentally the president's arguments, as Neil put it so bluntly yesterday on MSNBC, are written in crazy crayon, that his arguments are King George III plus, and that fundamentally he's trying to set himself up as a king. Judge Brown Jackson very eruditely wrote, that is not our system of government. That is not what the founding fathers intended from our democracy. And the president basically has no leg to stand on. So I want to explain to all of you just in real time a little bit here how this process is going to work. Because as predicted, I said this the second the opinion came down, I was expecting a very quick appeal. The notice of appeal was filed this morning. It has been filed in the DC Circuit. The DC Circuit, I will remind you all, is under the oversight of Chief Justice Merrick Garland. Reminder, that doesn't mean he's going to hear the case. Okay. The way that this works is that there is ordinarily a lottery that lands 3 judges from the DC Circuit on a given case. I'm just going to make a flat out prediction that the president's going to lose in the DC Circuit. I don't think there's anybody else, like literally no lawyer worth their salt, who thinks otherwise. This is such a cut and dried issue of democracy that the DC Circuit is, as everybody who watches this broadcast knows, considered to be one of the top 2 legal circuits in the country from the standpoint of the opinions that they issue. The vast majority of Supreme Court justices in this country have either served previously on the DC Circuit or the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. So the likelihood here that the president is going to win this on appeal is like I mean, I wouldn't even put it there. I just don't think there's any possibility that he's going to win in the DC Circuit. I will remind you all that once he loses in the DC Circuit, there's two possible next steps for this. He could either petition to have the case reheard by the entire DC Circuit, not just 3 judges, but the entire circuit itself, which is called petitioning for en banc review. Then the entire case would be reheard en banc and another opinion would issue. I also think, by the way, he would lose there. And then there is the opportunity at either stage after DC Circuit review to file a writ of certiorari to the Supreme Court. 4 justices of the Supreme Court have to agree to take a case. It will take 5 to overturn the decision of the DC District Court. I'm just going to tell you all, and I'm saying this particularly for the cynics and those of you who are really bitter out there right now, this is such a fundamental issue of American law that I can name at least 3 judges who ordinarily, and maybe 4, 3 judges who ordinarily vote on the conservative side of the bench who are very, very unlikely to vote in favor of the president's arguments in this case. Judge Roberts is a strict constitutionalist. What that means is that he is a part of the conservative wing of the law that believes that you read the Constitution literally. That means like literally. You do not read anything into the Constitution. He is not quite as strict a constitutionalist as Scalia was, for instance, but nonetheless, he is not a justice who is known for reading concepts that are wholly outside of the scope of American democracy into the Constitution, either for the left or for the right. And you know, I will just reiterate something that I said on Twitter last night, which is that the idea that these justices, and I'm not calling it just for Roberts. I will tell you, Gorsuch is in the same boat, and so is Alito. My view on this is that it would fundamentally be the overturning of our entire American democracy by the Supreme Court. I don't see it happening. The fundamental effect, by the way, and I will remind you all of this, of ruling in favor of the president on this particular issue, notwithstanding the fact that it is grounded in the idea of absolute immunity, is that if you give people permission to defy subpoenas, the entire rule of law will fall apart. And I will tell you that as much as I have been profoundly disappointed in the trajectory of the rule of law in this country since Trump was elected, I do not think that the Supreme Court is going to rule to kind of fundamentally overthrow the entire Constitution. I just don't see it. They're not revolutionaries apart from anything else. I just don't see it happening. So I think the trajectory of this is, by the way, for those of you who have asked, is likely to be quite short. I will remind those of you who don't remember Bush v. Gore, that decision went from a challenge in the district court to the Supreme Court and a ruling in 2 months, less than 2 months. There is a procedure for expedited review in cases that are of extreme national significance. This arguably would be one of them. My expectation is that we will see briefing and oral argument in front of the DC Circuit by early December. That would then tee this up to either be rejected by the Supreme Court for review or accepted by the Supreme Court before Christmas. And we would likely have a ruling early in the next year. So for those of you who are like, oh, it doesn't matter anyway, this is all going to take until July. That is not the way that it works in cases of this kind of import. So we're in a position now where the trajectory of this will happen very quickly. I will also remind you that if the Supreme Court refuses to take the case, the lower court decision stands. So assuming that he loses in the DC Circuit, and then thereafter that the Supreme Court rejects the case, that means that McGahn will have to be compelled to testify. It will also signal to folks like Bolton that they need to testify. It will also set up other people who have been subpoenaed along the lines of like Pompeo, that they need to testify. And it will further empower the district court through Judge Brown Jackson to sanction people who fail to comply, up to and including incarceration. So it's a very significant ruling. It's incredibly well crafted. It is designed with the understanding that it may end up in front of the Supreme Court. We have a quick trajectory here. My expectation is that the arguments that have been written by the president, again, in crazy crayon, I just love that expression. It just like made me laugh all day yesterday, will be rejected all the way up the chain of command here inside our judicial branch. So that was very good news yesterday. And I think we're going to have a final determination on that very quickly. Okay. There was some new polling this morning that I just want to draw your attention to, once again demonstrating that we are over 50% now for impeachment and removal of the president. However, I want to just flag one thing for you, which was a little bit disturbing. 64% of the women in this country now support impeachment and removal of the president based on this poll that came out this morning. Less than 50% of men do. It's like 43%. So I just will flag again that for those of you who watch this broadcast who are partnered with men, it would be a good time to have a little conversation with them. And again, I want to remind you all, you don't need to do it over Thanksgiving dinner, but, there is a really big flag here as to why there is such an enormous gender gap between men who are in favor of removal and women. Again, I can point to lots of things in that regard, not the least of which is, grab him by the you-know-what, and, more than 40 women having accused the president of sexual assaults, as well as, the kind of generalized understanding that narcissistic men don't make great leaders, and a fairly decent understanding of the fact that those who commit crimes will continue to commit them unless they are stopped. But all that said, I was quite disturbed by the gender gap in that particular poll this morning. Oh, and there goes my Alexa. And I will just let you all know. That's really funny. That's never happened. That's so funny. I've never had it flag me before while I've been sitting here. That's hysterical. Anyway, good to know Amazon's listening in. One of the things that I will just reiterate here is that the gender gap in particular is of concern. It should be of a concern going into 2020. It should also be of a concern for where we sit right now with regard to impeachment. And it's incredibly important, by the way, that those of you who are men also consider shouting out to other men around you the importance of the removal of this president for a whole host of reasons. We need your voices now more than ever. All right. We had a question about the nature of the impeachment trial in front of the Senate and how that process is likely to work. So let me just explain a couple more details about the nature of an impeachment trial so you all understand the kind of procedural background behind it. It seems like there's a kind of fairly deep degree of confusion about the procedures that apply in an impeachment. So what happens is once the articles of impeachment pass the House designates what are called managers of the impeachment from the House side of the fence. Those folks function fundamentally as prosecutors of the case against the president. So one of the things that means is that we will see a lot more of Dan Goldman, for instance. We're likely to see a lot more of Dan Goldman in the Senate part of the impeachment process. And we will also likely see folks like Adam Schiff engaged in prosecuting this president on the floor of the Senate. As I have mentioned to all of you before, and this is one of the places where there seems to be a fair amount of confusion, Mitch McConnell does not have control over the Senate impeachment trial. And indeed, he is not allowed under the terms of the Constitution to stop the impeachment trial or slow it down. Indeed, the clauses of the Constitution require that immediately upon, immediately is the language, excepting Sundays. Okay. This is, the era that we lived in then. But immediately upon a vote of the Senate, a vote of the House to impeach the president, the following day at 1:00, the Senate is required to take up the impeachment process. So Mitch McConnell can't stop it. He can't stall it. He can't, none of that is possible. And there's a lot of wild speculation out there about this. It's not possible. The Senate impeachment trial is overseen by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Again, that's Justice Roberts. And the managers from the House convey to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court the witnesses that they want to call, the evidence that they want to submit, the documents that they are going to plan to use as exhibits, and the like. And the Chief Justice then acts as the judge, so to speak, overseeing the Senate impeachment trial. So one of the things that means is that, if, for instance, the House managers, the House prosecutors convey their witness list to Chief Justice Roberts, ordinarily in a trial, if you say, I'm going to subpoena this person's on my witness list, the other side has an opportunity to challenge that. They can say things like, for instance, we feel like the testimony of this particular person isn't relevant. Justice Roberts will then rule on that just in the same way you would rule on it in any other court around the country. And of course, the defense, meaning the president's defense lawyers, will also have an opportunity to submit the witnesses that they want to use. The managers from the House, the prosecutors, will have an opportunity to challenge that in front of Chief Justice Roberts. He will make those decisions. And the subpoenas that we'll issue for purposes of impeachment will also be enforced by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So, one of the keys that I want to remind you of here is that there is no way in our system of government for Mitch McConnell to overrule the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in an impeachment trial. So this idea now, the kind of flag that the president is throwing out of I want an impeachment trial, or, so this morning there was a whole series of tweets, Pompeo should be allowed to testify. That's bullshit. Can I just say that? We all know that if the president wanted Pompeo to testify, he already would have testified. But I'll just add that the president is going to have a remarkable lack of control over the process of an impeachment trial in the Senate. That there is not going to be room for all of these wild machinations and Devin Nunes with all his crazy speculation and conspiracy theories. That's not going to fly in an impeachment trial. An impeachment trial is going to be much more rigorous. It is going to be much more balanced. It's going to look a lot like a criminal trial in a federal court of law. And that means, by the way, that the federal rules of evidence are going to apply to whether or not things are admissible, to what constitutes hearsay, to how documents can be used, to what constitutes a relevancy standard for purposes of evidence, which, by the way, is not Hunter Biden. And, we will see a significant degree of control over this process by Chief Justice Roberts. I will remind you all that every justice who sits on the Supreme Court at one point was a trial judge. And so those folks have all governed over trials, criminal and civil, and have a very profound and usually quite deep understanding of the way in which trials function in federal court. I have, quite a great degree of confidence, frankly, in the way in which this process is likely to flow. And I will also just add that while we may see McConnell try to do a few shots across the bow on this front, there are certain aspects of this process that are governed by the clauses of the Constitution that he literally can't touch. So President better be careful what he asks for, I guess is the way to put it. And I also will just remind you all that, subpoena enforcement will be handled by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That takes this all out of this crazy process that we've been in, by the way, in federal court to try to enforce subpoenas. And the rulings that are coming will also have a lot more predictive outcome, issue-oriented related stuff. How's that for analysis? The coming opinions will be a lot more predictive of the outcome of what will be compelled and what will not. So that brings me to one slight nuance with regard to the opinion of Judge Brown Jackson yesterday, as follows. There is one little caveat to the compelling of McGahn to testify, and that is the caveat of executive privilege. So I just want to let you all know, again, I know we have a lot of new viewers who haven't been watching the broadcast for the last 3 years nearly. We've done a lot of discussion about the very narrow scope of executive privilege under our Constitution. Executive privilege applies to discussions and advice that are given to the president in the course of his executive duties. So one of the things that means is that if Don McGahn, for instance, said to the president in the course of his duties, you should fight this particular legal argument, because as White House counsel, this particular legal argument, we have a leg to stand on, and it might be in our best interest to fight that in court. That would fall within the scope of executive privilege. It would be advising the president on how to carry out his duties in the course of his executive action. The same might be true, by the way, for actions taken by the president where he might be considering, can I do this under the law? If there was legal advice given to the president in that role, that might fall within the scope of executive privilege. What doesn't fall within the scope of executive privilege is the president saying to Don McGahn, go fire Robert Mueller, get it done. That's not something that is advice being given to the president in the course of his executive duties, right? So the line that was walked here by the judge, which was a very smart line, by the way, because there is precedent for the limits of executive privilege that say if the president is acting in the course of his official executive duties and he is getting advice from others, we need that advice to be confidential so that the president can consider all of his or her options. That is a limitation that we want, right? We want our presidents, when we're in a functioning democracy with a functioning president, to be able to consider the pros and cons of various positions without worrying that they're going to be sued for it. That's really the fundamental reason for some strict interpretation of executive privilege. So McGahn can, assert executive privilege within that narrow bound. Anything outside of it, though, anything outside of that scope, he is required to testify to. And so one of the things that also means for purposes of a Senate impeachment trial is that, for instance, if the president had conversations with Devin Nunes about interfering in Ukraine and trying to get Ukraine to interfere in our election, that's not covered by executive privilege. Conversations that the president had with Rudy Giuliani about Rudy Giuliani running around the country and getting, Parnas and Fruman to engage in election interference and to investigate the president's political rivals. That's not subject to executive privilege. So, we have a very narrow scope here of, and again, I'm going to remind you all, this is a scope that has existed for decades now, like since Nixon, right? Like there's nothing about this that is like new or different. Merely what happened yesterday with regard to executive privilege was a reiteration of the prior case law. And that means very bad things for this president, frankly. It means that anything else, like literally anything else, there is an obligation for his people to testify to if they are called to the court to an impeachment proceeding, whether it's part of the investigation or the trial, under a subpoena. So, again, this is just a reminder to all of you who are worried about how this is going to flow, that a Senate impeachment trial in particular is going to be very rigorous, is going to be locked down. I will tell you all, by the way, I am not worried. I know there's a lot of noise in the field about this morning. I am not worried about the process of an impeachment trial running up against the Iowa caucuses. I'm just not. I think that at this stage of the game, if the Democrats are worried about who's going to be able to be on the ground there, I would much rather save our democracy, and deal with a campaign in other ways than, allow the entire democracy to crumble because we're worried about whether or not, a senator is going to be able to be in Iowa enough. That to me just makes absolutely no sense. So from the standpoint of where we are right now, I don't care if the impeachment trial runs into February. I think it's far more important to make every effort to get the public in the loop about impeachment and the process underway, and hopefully crack a few more bricks in the Republican wall, and get him out if that's at all possible. So that's my 2 cents on that. All right. Somebody asked me about the UK elections. Let me just say this reminder. We have a general election in the UK upon which the only issue that matters at this point is Brexit. I'm tracking the polling on that for significant reasons, most of them related to the fact that Brexit is a part of the same op that got Trump elected. The pushback, if it can happen on Brexit here, will also have an impact on what happens in the United States. So reminder to all of you that the Conservative Party is in favor of any Brexit, no matter what it destroys. As of yesterday's polling, unfortunately, the Conservatives are still up in the UK, but Labour is gaining. There are problems within Labour as it stands right now, including some really serious, nasty anti-Semitic gaffes that have been made by its leaders. The Liberal Democrats, very much in favor of a new referendum on Brexit and Remain. The SNP, which is the Scottish National Party, wants Scotland basically to be independent. They are also not in favor of Brexit. The good news about all of this, however, is that the bloc that is coming together, if it's Labour, the Liberal Democrats, and the SNP, is far bigger than the bloc that the Conservatives hold. And so one of the things that means, by the way, is that if, because of the nature of their form of government as opposed to ours, is that if the bloc that comes together is majority anti-Brexit, they're going to have a really hard time getting a Brexit deal passed through Parliament in the UK. So, again, this is something to watch just simply because it's all related. I will also just let you know that Carol Cadwalader, who is a reporter with The Guardian in the UK, who has done all this work undermining Facebook's claims with regard to the 2016 election and with regard to Brexit, has been posting some very significant old videotape in the last couple of days from Russian KGB agents about the nature of the Russian plans to destroy democracy going back to the 70s. And all you have to do, I posted one of them last night on Twitter. All you have to do is go watch these tapes where they're talking about how you destabilize a nation in 2 to 5 years, and understand that where we are right now in the United States and in the UK follows this roadmap completely. These tapes talk about disinformation campaigns. They talk about undermining the capacity of the citizenry to make a logical argument in favor of democracy. They talk about the way in which the crisis points build until there are revolutionary moments, and then there's a coup, and then there's normalization of autocracy. This is something that has been planned by the Russians against the West for decades, and we're in the middle of it right now. So, one of the things that I just want to make really clear here, and again, I feel like I have to reiterate this from time to time, is that while everything that is happening in America is tragic and really difficult to handle, and on a day-to-day basis is draining, and fundamentally is post-traumatic stress inducing at this stage of the game. I will remind you all that we are not the only country in which this is happening, and the efforts to destabilize the entirety of Western democracy, to end the EU, to end NATO, all these things that President Trump is spouting, will mean very serious things for the future of the entire planet. And I mean that quite literally. The battle that we are in right now is a battle against the future survival of the entire planet, not just the survival of American democracy. And so it's really key at this stage of the game that we continue to battle back on all fronts. And this is one of the reasons why, the deadlines to register to vote, which is next Tuesday in the UK, is something that I keep shouting out. And, follow Ian Dunt. There are plenty of really great reporters at The Guardian who are tracking all of this. Please be informed, because you will note if you choose to do this, you will note the dramatic overlap between what is happening elsewhere in the EU and in the UK and here. And yes, you're right, Doreen. It is astounding. The breadth of this is astounding. And this, by the way, it tells you everything you need to know about Putin and his aims. He is hell-bent on the destruction of the planet as long as it makes him richer. And he's, at this moment in time, predicted to be the richest person on the planet. Like, let's make no mistake about it. And also that from an ideological standpoint, absolute power is the only thing that drives him. He's a profoundly dangerous human being, and our president is in his pocket. Again, here we are. Last thing that I want to say before we take our little break for Thanksgiving. I want all of you at this point in time to be thinking about what you're going to be doing in 2020. And one of the things that I have been framing out, particularly for the women and other folks who have been in our programs over the last little while, but that feels really profoundly important to say right now, is that it is a good moment over this holiday to start thinking about where you are going to invest your time and energy heading into 2020. I have insisted that those of us who are in our programs over the last couple of months actually write roadmaps of how they're going to engage for the 2020 election. What is your plan? What is your commitment? What are you going to do? What are your timetables for that? Are you committing to going canvassing once a month? Are you committing to postcard parties once a month? Are you committing to phone banking once a week for your preferred candidate? This is the moment to actually write it down. And to me, one of the reasons why this is so critically important is because our civic engagement at this moment in time is what's going to predict whether our democracy survives or not. If, God forbid, if Trump is reelected in 2020, our democracy will end. I try not to come on here and be profoundly dramatic, but it's true. We'll be done. So the key here for all of us is to understand that all of our engagement matters, in the smallest and the largest of ways. And you need to decide at this point in time what your choices are going to be heading into 2020. I'll also just add Walt Schaub, who you all know I am an enormous fan of, who was a big chunk of amplification for issues that I really cared about over the summer. This morning suggested that even those of us who are on incredibly fixed budgets can afford to send 1 cent into an organization that we care about that is fighting to save democracy. The thing I love about this is that, I think all of us, I know I do, have a spare penny laying around in my house somewhere that I could be sending to someone as a donation. And if the many millions of Americans would choose to come together and do this, we would have organizations that then could be empowered and supported financially to really fight back in new ways going into the 2020 election. We need that. Our government is not going to fight for us. The election security that we need is gone. So just really critically want to remind all of you to decide how you're going to engage. The smallest efforts really do make a difference collectively. You as an individual really can make a difference in the context of what you choose to do locally and in your community and in the world. So take a few minutes over this Thanksgiving, be grateful for what you have. Certainly, remind all those around you that, as long as this is true, that you are grateful for their presence in your life. And then take some time and think about how you're going to pay it forward, because we all need to do that right now, seriously. So I'm just going to say this. I'm very grateful for all of you. I'm very grateful for your participation here. I'm grateful for your support throughout this entire year and for all of your efforts out there in the world. We're heading into our 4th year of Resistance Live, which is insane to me, come January. And of course, none of this would exist without all of you. So much gratitude to all of you. And let's, pull it together and organize and get ready for 2020. Enjoy your holiday. I will talk to all of you on Monday. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye.